There we go.
Okay, I have unmuted myself, and now it is my pleasure to introduce Tom Prestby.
Oops, better unmute yourself again.
Our speaker tonight is Tom Prestby, who many of you will remember from several previous programs he has put together for the Bird Club. And a few of you will remember Tom as a member of the Bird Club, dating back almost 20 years ago. Tom has been on a number of our field trips over the years. But in those 20 years, he has built an incredibly impressive career as one of the state's, I think, most important bird biologists. I saw a copy of Tom's resume, and I was going to read some of it to you tonight, except because it covers all of his field work and all of the other research he has done. It runs 16 pages. As I told Tom on another call earlier today, he has studied more birds in more places than just about anybody else I know. He's been a pivotal player with the Wisconsin Breeding Bird Atlas, not only with the field work he has done, but in the 2 years since we wound up field work, he has invested a lot of time and energy in vetting those records and getting them ready for incorporation in the Atlas when it is published. Most recently, Tom has left GEI Consultants in Green Bay, with which he did some of the work that he is going to present tonight, to take a job as Wisconsin Conservation Manager for Great Lakes Audubon. I hope he'll talk at least briefly about what lies ahead with that as well. So Tom, I don't know how you want to present this, but you've got it set up now so that on my screen I'm seeing your regular slide and your next slide as well. So if that's what you intend.
No, let's see here. Let me play with this for a second here. There, I think how about now? Can you still see the next slide?
Yep. No, we can now just see your main slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I think we're good.
Cool. And let's see.
Take it away.
All right. Well, thanks so much for the kind words, Carl. And yeah, I've presented for several bird clubs over the years, but the River Edge or the Noel Cartwright Bird Club always has a soft spot in my heart because, as Carl said, been coming to meetings when I was in high school down in the Milwaukee area, going on field trips like the North Woods field trip with Carl and Noel and Marilyn when I was too young, and my dad, who is in the audience tonight, would drive me and spot birds with us. So yeah, and I did not realize that this was Carl's last night as program director. So I feel very honored that someday in a trivia question, I'll be the answer to a question. But yeah, I'm going to talk tonight about, or first, I guess, yeah, Carl introduced me, but like he said, I am now the Wisconsin Conservation Manager for Audubon Great Lakes, and I live in Green Bay, and I wound up here because I went to graduate school up here where I researched shorebirds and terns. So kind of been all over the state, but yeah, I've wound up here in the Green Bay area. So I'll be talking about important bird area assessment that I did for Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership last year in my role at GEI Consultants. But one of the nice things about my new Audubon job is that I'm going to be able to continue working on this IBA project, helping take it to the next state, the next level, as a part of my current job. So very excited about that. Let's see. Okay, there we go. So just to start basic here, you'll see the acronym IBA all over the place in this presentation tonight. That stands for Important Bird Area. And just real simple definition is a distinguishable site providing essential habitat for birds. And obviously that's a very basic definition. You could define that even as a woodlot sometimes, but these are places that, like I said, are distinguishable, stand out from other nearby places. They supply all or most of the needs for the certain group of birds that uses it in a season or multiple seasons. And I'll talk about these criteria later, but they have to meet a list of defined criteria. That's how they become IBAs. So that's what distinguishes these from other areas is people, biologists, bird watchers, and others have nominated sites across the state, and then for that matter, the country and the world as IBAs. And then a committee has approved those for meeting the criteria. So in Wisconsin, you can see a map here. Those green polygons are where our IBAs are. There were originally 86 of them, and we've added 7 more in about the last decade and a half. So we're up to 93 now, and that's how many I analyzed last year. And the Important Bird Areas book, which some of you may have, is currently the best source for information for each IBA. There's a nice narrative that describes each IBA. They have the nominations listed for how the IBA meets the criteria, and a bunch of that info is also on the IBA website as well. In Google, you can just put in Wisconsin important bird areas, and that will take you right to it. I do want to recognize first, and I'll probably be referring to these a couple times through my presentation tonight, but we do have some very, very successful partnership IBAs in the state. And I'm going to be talking tonight about IBAs that are very successful, like Leopold Pine Island, because they have a lot of partners, and then people who volunteer their time, like Steve Swenson, if you know him, at Leopold Pine Island, who are excellent at grassroots conservation, getting others involved and making things happen for the birds in the IBAs. The Kickapoo Wildcat IBA out in the Driftless area, that's been another wonderful partnership between the Mississippi Valley Conservancy, the Driftless Area Land Conservancy, the DNR, and other partners. So those are 2 of the gold stars that we look at in the IBA program, and I'll touch on it at the end for where we want to go in our future steps, but we're going to be hopefully adding to this list of successful partnerships. So the goals for I'm going to talk mainly about the analysis that I did of the important bird areas in the state and what came out of it. And the goals were to assess the IBAs in the state, the conservation values for them, to find threats to the IBAs, possible resilience to climate change or lack thereof. That's obviously a huge issue whenever you talk any kind of conservation these days, because you have to take that into account. We're already experiencing climate change, and models are for that only to increase. And identifying conservation opportunities in a list of 5 to 15 priority IBAs. And then, yeah, identifying stakeholders and possible partnerships at or near those IBAs. I'm going to use the word decision support tool a lot tonight. And basically the decision support tool is the way that I evaluated all of the IBAs. I don't need to get too much into the weeds because I don't need to get too technical here. But basically use Microsoft Excel to kind of keep track of all of the things in each IBA that I was analyzing, and then weighted each of those, and I'll talk more about this on the next slide. And then at the end, put all of that information in GIS. So now the land managers around the state, other biologists who are interested in my data, if they want, not only can they look at my report on the findings, but they could also go into GIS, click on an IBA, and all of the information would come up. So I just referenced that I analyzed about a dozen things for each IBA, and this is the list of factors that we analyzed. When I say we, I'm mainly talking about myself and the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership IBA committee. And we gave weights to each of these factors. So basically, the species diversity was a low weight and the local involvement was a high weight. So if an IBA had really good species diversity, that factored into the overall score less than if an IBA had really good local involvement. That's what I mean by those different categories. So I'll go through how I analyze each of these. So I won't list them off right now, so don't worry if you didn't get to read all of them. But yeah, these are the factors that we identified and is the meat in the analysis that I did. So the first one of those, which you saw was low weight, was the size and the shape of the IBA. And on this map here, you can see this is the IBAs in northern Wisconsin, but we just wanted to look at this because, I mean, these are basic ecological principles. The larger a conservation area is, usually the more successful it is. And then the more regular shaped area. So we're looking for, when we score this out, like if you see Moose Junction peatlands there in the northwest corner of the state in Douglas County, big intact area. But if you compare that to the Brule Glacial Spillway, you might be able to barely see it. It's right next to there. That's more of a long linear IBA. So that would score less in shape because there's more edge habitat likely because it's more long and linear. But again, these lines are drawn arbitrarily, so that's part of the reason that it's weighted so low. It's not really that important, but we wanted to look at it in our analysis. This migratory breeding metric sounds more complicated than it is, basically. It's a tracking of, is the IBA important to birds for breeding, for migration, for winter, or some combination, or all of the above. And you can see the criteria on the right here. So how I evaluated this was basically, again, referring to the book and the website with the nominations for each IBA. and digging into if the IBA was designated because it supported large groups of birds or certain bird species for breeding or migration or winter or all the above. So obviously, the more seasons, the higher the score for this. And this was another pretty low, I think it was like low to moderate weighted. Species diversity, these next few that I talk about are factors that I used eBird data for. Hopefully most people in the audience are familiar with eBird. And now that used to be one of my roles like 10 years ago, was going around to bird clubs trying to convince people to use eBird. But now that we have the app on our cell phone and everything, it's a lot easier than it used to be. So anyway, one of the awesome things about eBird and why we want people to use eBird is because the data goes into projects like this and a ton of other projects throughout the world. I was able to pull up the data for each IBA, and that includes data that was literally submitted in real time up to then. So really nice thing is that includes the recent breeding bird atlas, the first breeding bird atlas, and anytime somebody has birded in one of these IBAs and submitted a checklist within the bounds of the IBA. So what data did I look at? I had basically 3 different categories. So if a bird just turned up once, it was factored in, but if a bird was semi-regular, it was factored in at a higher level. And then if a bird was observed regularly, it was even a higher level. So for example, if I was analyzing Lower Green Bay and there was a black tern seen, that would be good. But if it was only seen once or twice, that would barely matter. But if it was seen occasionally, that would be better. And then if there were a breeding colony or something like that, and they were detected regularly, then the IBA would get more points for that factor. Climate sensitive species, I referenced a little bit earlier that one of the big focuses on this project is the climate resilience possibilities for each IBA. And we looked at that for the actual species that use the IBA and for landscape factors, which I'll get to in a couple minutes here. But for the species factor, we were really lucky because Audubon released a report just a few months before doing this analysis, where they identified 389 species of birds that are threatened by climate change. And they had a list of highly vulnerable species and moderately vulnerable species. So with all that eBird data, I looked for species on that Audubon list, and for all the species in an IBA that are highly vulnerable, it would get double the credit. And for all the species that were moderately vulnerable, it would get some credit. So basically, if an IBA is harboring species such as this Canada jay that are vulnerable to climate change, then that's going to help increase the conservation potential score for that IBA. Next list of species would be listed species, which is basically threatened or endangered species. But we went a couple steps beyond that. This little chart here is just basically how we weighted our formula. And you can see that the state threatened, the state endangered species, so birds like black tern, red-shouldered hawk, got a little bit lower of a weight. And then there's the US Fish and Wildlife Service joint venture list, which are birds that don't nest in Wisconsin, so they're not listed by the DNR for Wisconsin, but they might be in peril. And they stop here as a migrant. So that's like some of our shorebirds, some of our warblers that nest north of the state, etc. And then that global rank, we rank that really high because we figure we want this analysis to be on a broader scale than just Wisconsin. So if a bird is ranked in peril globally and an IBA is supporting that bird, we thought that was more important than if an IBA is supporting a population of a bird that's listed in Wisconsin or even nationally, but is doing better globally. So yeah, there's a couple different distinctions there. So these next few, I'm going to be talking about spatial data, and that's a GIS analysis that we ran. And there was another very fortunate data set that was released right before this analysis called Conserving Nature's Stage, and the Nature Conservancy was one of the main authors on that. And basically it was a big GIS analysis that was ran, and it predicts the climate change vulnerability to areas throughout the country. So we were able to overlay the IBA polygons in GIS on this analysis and then score it accordingly. So there's some more detailed maps in a second here, so don't worry about what you're seeing on this map, but you'll see that this is the state of Wisconsin here. And for these next few maps, the legend will be the same, where green will basically mean really good and brown, dark brown will mean really bad, and then a gradient in between. So resilience was the first factor that we looked at in this part of the analysis, and that's the capacity to maintain species diversity and ecological function as the climate changes. So basically what you're looking for there is variability in the microclimate. So if a small area where a species is living gets too warm or too rainy or too dry, too cold, whatever the example would be, does it have areas nearby with slightly different microclimates where it might be able to seek refuge in and keep surviving in the event of the climate changing? Usually wetlands can provide that. Topographical changes can provide that, so change in elevation. So that's why you may or may not recognize where we are here in this screenshot, but that's Horicon Marsh on the left and the North Kettle Moraine on the right. And the North Kettle Moraine basically jumps off the page being dark green because what does that have? That has a lot of elevational variability and several wetlands. And then Horicon Marsh, it's green, but not as green as the Kettle Moraine because it has the wetlands, but it doesn't have the elevation gradient that the Kettle Moraine does. So then in between, in farm country near Brownsville and Lomira and all those areas, you can see it's a lot less resilient. And there's no surprise there because a lot of that is developed agricultural farm country. So another thing we looked at then is landscape diversity. Pretty similar, looks at a lot of the same things like microhabitats, climate gradients, again, a variety of land cover being available. So again, that same idea where are there several variable areas nearby where if something changed and a species couldn't survive where it currently is, could it survive nearby in the same area? Connectedness, that's just what it sounds like. How connected is the landscape basically? So Things that decrease connectedness are roads, development, agriculture. So basically breaks in the habitat. And here, this screenshot, it's not quite as obvious where we are, but this is the Pentonwell flowage in the middle here. So we're out in west central Wisconsin. And I wanted to use this screenshot because it really demonstrates things well. It was actually some of the River Edge Bird Club field trips I used to go to, where on our way up to the North Woods, we would go to the Bear Bluff area, where you can see golden eagles sometimes in winter. And the dark green out there is very eye-popping. And if you've ever been there, it's not that surprising because there's not a lot of roads, lots of undeveloped habitat that's very connected. That little yellow splotch in the middle by the second N and Connect, I could almost guarantee you that that's probably a cranberry farm. But anyway, very connected. The IBA next to that is the Necedah National Wildlife Refuge. Again, quite a bit of connection there, but a little bit less in the Bear Bluff area because there's more roads in there. And a little bit more development, even though it is a wildlife refuge. But we look to the north, that is the Paul Olson IBA, and very, very low connectedness scores. And why is that? That's because there's a ton of agriculture up there. There's a lot of roads, including some major roads like Highway 10, I think Highway 54, goes through there. So some major roads, lots of fragmentation of the habitat. So those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. And then on the right hand side of the screenshot, that's the Buena Vista grasslands. And you can see that's kind of a mixed bag where there's some green in there for some of the areas that have a lot of grass next to each other, or in the case of the area west of there, a lot of pine trees and young forests that run connected with each other. But then you can see in the eastern portions of that IBA, more of that brown and yellow. And again, that's because there's more development and more farm country. Highway 39 is over there. So yeah, those are the examples of how we measured connectedness. So then for the rest of the threats, we did this by sending a survey to more than 200 people in the state. And we identified people for each IBA, and that was everywhere in between wildlife biologists for DNR, refuge staff for Fish and Wildlife Service, people who are land managers for the Nature Conservancy and other land trusts, and then bird watchers who bird watch in these IBAs a lot, because even though they might not manage the land, there's a lot of cases where they might be some of the most familiar people with what birds are there and what's going on in and near those IBAs. So 33 questions total, and we had a really, really good response rate, much better than I was predicting. And we actually kind of got lucky with the COVID situation, because we sent this out last spring, right when all of the stay-at-home orders and everything was going on, and no one could really go to meetings or be out doing field work. So I think we got a lot of responses from people who are typically really busy, and we got more responses than we may have in a normal year. But some of the things we looked at in this survey, we looked at threats to the IBA. So that includes human caused threats and natural threats. When I say natural, I should put that in quotes, because obviously it's a debate whether some things that we consider natural are actually natural, or those are more just indirect human-based threats. But anyway, and and not only just what threats exist out there, but what's the severity of those threats, and then what's the public attitude towards those threats. If everybody's against a threat, that's going to be a lot easier to fight than if us bird watchers think it's a threat, but another really big aspect of the community is welcoming whatever we're perceiving as a threat. For management, we asked a few questions on management, and generally this is things like what kind of habitats there, how easy or difficult is that to maintain, how many invasive species are there, what's the invasive species management plan. And so sites with the least amount of management score highest because they're easier to maintain. Obviously, sites with the least amount of invasive species are going to score higher than sites that are already running rampant with buckthorn or garlic mustard, because it's going to be a lot harder to try to get back to a stage where invasives aren't an issue. And in some places, it's even impossible now. Local involvement, like I said before, this was a high rated factor because even if an IBA is spectacular, if it's in the middle of nowhere or for some other reason there isn't any interest in it or involvement from the bird watchers or the general public who live near it, then really not gonna be able to do much. So really wanted to try to get an idea for how much local involvement there is. And when I say that, I'm talking about things like partnerships that might be already existing, non-government advocacy. Are there really active bird watching groups like this group and several other similar groups? Is there a funding history for projects that have happened in the past, and are those funders still in the picture, possibly for future projects? So sites with the most diverse involvement and potential and the greatest amount of activities going on scored higher in this metric. And then finally, the last one, ownership. This one's a little bit tricky, but when it comes down to it, the more public land or land that was in conservation easement or anything like that, where we know that it's conserved, was scored higher because we can count on that land being there long term, and the fact that we might have an influence in how to manage it for bird habitat. So areas with a lot of private land scored lower. Here you see the Wisconsin River. You see Governor Dodge State Park is that small IBA that's almost all dark yellow. And that's because, yeah, it's pretty much all that state park. So it's all public land. The Wisconsin River north of there, you see a patchwork of a lot of DNR land along the river, but also a lot of surrounding land that's private. But then you go to the south, you see the Military Ridge, York Prairie IBA, which is almost all private land. So obviously there's some places where groups like Prairie Enthusiasts and some of the land conservancies have done wonderful work on private property, but it's an uphill battle when almost the whole IBA is private property. So I'm not going to get too far into this. Your eyes might be hurting you looking at this slide, but don't worry, I won't be on it too long. Just wanted to show what it looked like once everything I just talked about kind of got spat back out of Microsoft Excel, and each row is an IBA, and they all contribute to a maximum score of 100. So then the fun part for me was seeing how each IBA scored in each factor, and I used a color gradient because otherwise it'd be even more painful on my eyes. So in red, you're seeing a low score. In green, that's a high score. Yellow, orange, kind of in the middle. So it wasn't really, a lot of the scores were pretty close to each other, like within decimal places, but how an IBA got to its total score was a lot more important than the actual score. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too. Just a quick disclaimer here. We definitely want to make sure we're messaging this work the right way. We're definitely not coming up with like a top 15 IBAs in Wisconsin list or anything like that, or saying that IBAs that scored high are good and IBAs that scored low are bad. There's lots of reasons that IBAs scored the way they did. And a lot of times a lower score just means there's more opportunity for improvement and more opportunity for conservation efforts to increase the value of the IBAs. So definitely not any kind of like black and white statement of these are the best IBAs in the state or these are insufficient IBAs or anything like that. So then there's a couple ways you can graphically look at the data, and this here, this map of the state is the ecological landscapes of Wisconsin, and the little circles there, you might be able to see they're red or green or yellow. Those correspond with what I just showed you, the overall scores for each IBA. So here is just a way you can visualize, like you can see in some of the landscapes, like the driftless area, we have a lot of IBAs that are green and that kind of greenish yellow. So that's a landscape that is supporting IBAs in general that are scoring really well in this analysis. Probably a large part in due to the GIS analysis, where remember I said elevation gradient helps a place be resilient toward climate change. But also we have documentation of listed species and things like that in the eBird data. Also the northwestern sands, you can see there's quite a bit of green up there. But then there's some like the central sands where we have a lot of red. And again, lots of agriculture in those areas. This north central Wisconsin area, lots of red. I to this day still am not really sure why that pattern is so prominent, but yeah, it looks like it's there, although it's only a few IBAs, so maybe it's not as big of a pattern as it looks like it could be. Here's a little bit more detailed graphic representation, and I wanted to show your area of the state here. So I don't know if I did a good job of explaining it earlier or not, but I talked about all those 12 factors that we analyzed, but then with those factors, I was kind of able to bin them into 3 different categories. So there's those species factors, like the threatened endangered species, the climate resilient species, and just overall species diversity. And then that landscape integrity analysis was that GIS analysis I was talking about with the resilience, the connectivity, and then the social factors was what we got from that survey data, like local involvement, threats, things like that. So these here, the polygons you're seeing are the IBAs, and then the color represents how they scored in those factors. So you look at some of the ones close to home here, I believe that one right on the Sheboygan-Ozaki border, that's the Harrington Beach, Colarandre area IBA. The one to the south of there is the Ozaki Bight IBA. That really small one, really close to where you guys are based out of, is obviously the Cedarburg Bog, which was one of our higher scoring IBAs. But you can see how some of these like look at North Kettle Moraine, which is kind of in the middle here on the border of Fond du Lac and Sheboygan counties, the species factors, it scored a little bit lower, which actually kind of surprised me because there's quite a few listed species there. But again, there's always caveats with eBird data. There's lots and lots of checklists being submitted, and this was more about what percent of checklists had listed species on it. So could be a reason for that, but landscape integrity analysis, like I said earlier, it did well for those. And again, not a surprise because lots of wetlands there, lots of variability in the elevation. But then social factors for Kettle Moraine, you see it yellow, so middle of the road. So just at a quick glance, if someone asked me, how can we improve bird conservation delivery to the North Kettle Moraine IBA? One of my first thoughts would be, well, it looks like there might be some room for improvement in local involvement and some of the social factors, because we know the landscape integrity and resilience is really good. And then since species factors were low, that, like I said, could just be a data caveat, but maybe that encourages some more species surveys elsewhere in the Kettle Moraine, aside from what was done in the Atlas and other projects. So again, just a couple more notes. I know I've thrown a lot of data and things like that at you in the last half hour here. This again is a step in informing a decision-making process, and we're actually going through that decision-making process right now in the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership. Like I said, a lot of the IBAs, you don't really want to look at the overall score because they're so close to each other. It's really important how they got there. So don't just use that as a ranking, like I said earlier, because that's not what we're trying to do. And then, yeah, there's always caveats with some of the data that we looked at. eBird data, as an eBird reviewer, I could give a whole talk about eBird data caveats, but yeah, it depends on what kind of effort somebody was birding with, the skill of the observer, GIS data. A lot of it depends on where exactly that line is when you're doing something like this. So an arbitrary boundary can have more impact than you would like it to have. So anyway, again, one of the main goals was to find 5 to 15 priority IBAs. And we did that. We found, we have a list of 15 high priority IBAs that came out in the scoring, and then a little bit more than 20 moderate ranked IBAs, or moderate potential IBAs. And the difference between the high and the moderate, these are all high scoring IBAs, but the high potential has shortcomings that are easier to address, things that can possibly be manipulated, like private land management, working with private landowners, or possibly acquiring private land when there's opportunities to do so, threats that are addressable, and then partnerships and involvement of nearby bird watchers or nature enthusiasts. The moderate ranked ones, those are also scoring high, but a lot of what they are good at are less influential. So it's harder to increase the score by taking action than in some of those high potential IBAs. Then this, I know this is really small, so don't worry about reading any of this or anything, but again, this is just kind of how we sorted some of the data. These are some of the IBAs on the left here, the names, then some of their scores in the next couple columns, but we just wanted to sort, again, low scoring aspects, moderate scoring aspects, and high scoring aspects. And again, the long-term goal for the IBA program is to move as many of the low scoring aspects into the moderate or the high category, and the moderate scoring aspects into the high category as we can, because obviously that will increase the bird conservation in that IBA. And like I said before, some factors it's easier than others. Like if the IBA is low in resilience, that's going to be it's really hard to impossible to improve that, because you're not gonna be able to do much to change the landscape. But if it's something like local involvement where the IBA scored low, then if there's opportunities for partnerships or events that bird watchers would want to be involved in, then that's something that's easier to increase the score in. So just a couple of application examples here. This one would involve, like, say, the land trusts in the state. We're looking at Southwest Wisconsin here. I mentioned Mississippi Valley Conservancy earlier. They're an excellent land trust for conserving bird and other natural habitat. And they happen to be in an area with several high scoring IBAs. Part of the reason is a lot of the great work they did. But again, like I said before, part of the reason is probably because they're in a landscape with high resilience and connectivity, where the scores for this analysis were high because of what we looked at. And basically, they've already done a lot of work in the Kickapoo Wildcat Reserve, and that's received a lot of excellent work from them and their partners. These little white polygons here, that's the properties that they manage. So you can see they have some on the south tip of this, but they're looking for other areas to work. So when they can look at this data and say, well, where else are some areas where we can make some bang for our buck? And as I've been talking to some of their managers, I said, okay, well, you've got some really good opportunities, thankfully, because the Rush Creek Forest IBA and the Lower Kickapoo River IBA both scored high in this analysis as IBAs with high potential for conservation improvements. So they're excited about the fact that areas in their jurisdiction, they can do some of the same successful things that they did in the Kickapoo Wildcat IBA. So then after my analysis this year, I worked with a grad student at UW-Madison named Rachel Klicko. And for her project, we were looking at, we wanted to look at these top 15 potential IBAs and get even more information, go farther in depth than my survey did last year. And how did we pick those IBAs? Well, again, it was a lot of the ones that scored well in my analysis, but we also, these are, so the IBAs that ended up in the top 15 for those three bins of factors that I mentioned, the species, the landscape integrity, and the social. If an IBA appeared in more than one of those top 15s, like you can see Apostle Island shows up a couple times, Menominee Forest is in all three, Wyalusing State Park area is in multiple ones. You know there's something going on with that IBA where it's scoring high for multiple reasons. So we wanted to pick the IBAs that scored really highly in multiple groups of categories like that. So we found, I think she contacted people in 21 different IBAs in the state. I'll have a map of them on my next slide. But yeah, we came up with a list of questions with the IBA subcommittee that I worked with last year. And again, it was very pointed, specific questions. My survey last year was kind of more general questions. these were more specific questions, like how exactly, how could you be helped by the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership Committee if we had resources to put into your IBA? Do you have the capacity if we, because some of these IBAs don't even have the capacity to receive help right now, and we need to build that groundwork, but some are already in a position where we can help them a lot even with limited resources, and that was kind of what we wanted to flesh out. So some of the really common themes that we found, that she found in her interviews, were IBAs looking for technical assistance. So that's things like, what are the rare species in our IBAs? What do we do for them? How do we reach out to landowners with the advocacy? Education. We noticed a big theme too, that this IBA program sounds great, or at least I hope it does when I talk about it, but a lot of people have never heard of the IBA program, or if they have, they don't really know what it is, including a lot of the people who work in DNR or Fish and Wildlife. So there needs to be more education about what exactly the IBA program is, what it means for an area to be an IBA, and how to leverage the fact that you have one of these areas that you're working on to get things like grant funding and things like that. What our target audience is for messaging came up a couple times, and then coordination, funding, those kind of things are always going to come up when you're working with partnerships and things like that. Obviously, you can do some things without funding, but having grants to work on stuff is what drives the bus a lot of the time. So then I think this might be one of my last slides here, but obviously, since I'm talking to a very engaged bird club, one of the most engaged bird clubs that I can think of off the top of my head, I know that a natural question would be, how can a bird club like us help out? And the nice thing is these red IBAs are kind of what, we haven't finalized this yet, because like I said, we're still kind of in strategy mode in the Wisconsin Bird Conservation Partnership, but these red IBAs are really the ones that kind of jumped out at us as what the priority IBA, what are looking like the priority IBAs in the state for increasing bird conservation partnerships. So you guys are really lucky because you're near several of them. The North Kettle Moraine isn't too far away. You've got the Harrington Beach one, which is more of an offshore IBA. Same with up in the Cleveland area, North Sheboygan, South Manitowoc County. Cedarburg Bog also scored excellent for those of you affiliated with that IBA, but that's one of those where we considered it more in the moderate category because it's already doing so well. It's kind of like Horicon Marsh or Crex Meadows or something like that, where it's already kind of a gold star. And obviously that's a really good thing, but for this exercise, we wanted to look for IBAs that might need a little bit more help, but they have the background in place where a little bit of help could really kickstart them. So anyway, yeah, bird clubs can definitely play a really big role in partnerships, whether it's advocacy for an IBA, whether it's going into these IBAs, getting more eBird data, whether it's partnering with other people nearby, like the Western Great Lakes Bird and Bat Observatory, the DNR, private companies even sometimes, all sorts of things like that. Land trusts, you've obviously got the Ozaukee, Washington Land Trust nearby. So those are the kind of things we'll be working on. I'm sure I'll be reaching back out to you guys when we start talking about possible partnerships for some of these areas. But yeah, just know that you definitely do have multiple IBAs near you that scored rather highly. So again, like I said, right now we're kind of strategizing. We had a big workshop last week to kind of talk through some of our next steps, and we'll be doing that for the rest of the year. But I think next year we're all excited that we should be able to get this next phase in motion in terms of actually delivering some of the things we've been setting the stage for in the last couple years. Some possible likely products include some regional workshops where we discuss these more in specific, and then really start laying the groundwork for partnerships on specific things that can be done in these IBAs by partners like the Noel Cartwright Bird Club, fact sheets for IBAs where someone, if they wanted to, could go in and briefly see, okay, cool, these are the rare birds here, this is how you can help them, these are the threats for the IBAs, things like that. And then obviously maybe trying to find some pilot partnerships in some of the areas that are in red here, and then elsewhere in the state. Just like I've said several times tonight, just because an IBA isn't in red or isn't in the highest scoring bracket of what I did absolutely does not mean that it is a undesirable IBA or that doesn't have potential to work in. There's tons of IBAs that I know are awesome areas for birds, lots of great people involved there, and they're not in red. So if your favorite IBA is not, do not feel bad. But yeah, I can open it up for questions or comments now. My new Audubon email address is at the bottom there. It's basically just my first name dot my last name at audubon.org. So if you think of a question once we sign off and you want to drop me an email, feel free. But yeah, I know I threw a lot at you, and I'm hoping that people were able to retain some of this. Was a pretty in-depth effort, so it's always hard to try to water it down a little bit, but I also wanted to give a lot of the details because I think knowing what details went into it is important too. So thanks for the attention. Thanks for the time. Like I said, it's always really fun to present to this group, and yeah, I'll open it up for any questions or comments.
Marilyn, I saw that you had a question about the offshore bite.
Yes, I do, Tom. It would be number 36. I think you called it the Ozaki bite,
Yeah,
but it actually includes Audubon also, does it not?
yeah, it does.
Okay. So is it only the offshore area that is considered then, and not any of the land?
So the coastline definitely is considered. I would have to open up the actual I'd have to open up the GIS layer to see for sure, but there is, I believe the Schlitz Audubon Center is included because there are some areas because they wanted to include stopover habitat too in some offshore areas. So even though most of the IBA is offshore, to focus on things like the ducks and loons and grebes and all that.
Right.
The sliver of land along the shore is indeed included in those IBAs. And you're correct, that does include Schlitz as well as, I believe, Doctor's Park.
So my question has to do with the fact that just north of Schlitz Audubon Center, on some private property where there are homes, there have been barges full of house-sized rocks coming into the shore from further south, someplace in Milwaukee probably. And there are cranes on shore, and the cranes are lifting these house-sized rocks and putting them along the shore. And this has been going on for about a month now, or maybe more. And I'm just wondering how that is going to affect the bird habitat out there, or will it not affect the ducks and things like that, except for while the crane is hanging around and the boats are coming and going. You mentioned near the end of your talk that you didn't think that the DNR necessarily knew about an IBA, which makes me wonder how the people got permission to do the amount of work that they are doing there on their shore.
Yeah, those are really good questions, and some of those require local knowledge that I don't have, but yeah, I would think that yeah, obviously if there's a crane out there moving boulders, that's definitely going to be disturbing things that are migrating through. Now, from a legal perspective, I know that since I come from a consulting background, I know that at times something can be allowed as long as it's not disturbing, like a threatened or an endangered species while it's breeding. But yeah, you raise a really good point in terms of, like, I'd be surprised if whoever gave them that permit knew that that was an IBA, or if they did, knew the significance of that IBA, and that affecting habitat out in the water could be a big deal. And yeah, sometimes, like I said, the IBAs are really well known in the area, and a lot of times people have no idea. And I would assume that this, especially these ones where they're more out in the water and probably not publicized a whole lot. I mean, that's a lot of what we're trying to do here, is increase the advocacy and the awareness of these IBAs. So maybe in the future, if someone tries to do something like this, there's more support for that IBA in the background, and that can be used to possibly make them time it differently, or not do it at all. Now, obviously there's other factors too, like they might be doing it now because if they did it in spring or summer, they could be affecting fish populations or something like that. So there's obviously some things that are out of our control from a bird perspective. But yeah, long story short, definitely a case where knowing that an IBA is there because it's been promoted more would help a lot, or at least maybe a little bit. I shouldn't say a lot, because sometimes legal things are out of our hands, but yeah.
Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, no problem.
Anybody else with a question? Unmute yourself and shout. Tom, you might want to take your screen, unshare your screen.
Oh,
We'll put
yeah,
us back
sure.
up and we'll put us back up into
Let's see here.
group view, and people can turn the cameras back on or unmute themselves. I have one quick question. I wondered if you could just speak very briefly about what else besides IBAs you'll be concentrating on in your new job.
Sure, good question. So as the new conservation manager for Wisconsin for Audubon, I have a few main tasks, one of which is advancing the IBA program, which I'm excited about because it's kind of statewide. Obviously, you saw there's IBAs all over the state, including some of our priority scoring IBAs, but also we are heavily involved in habitat restoration projects, especially coastal wetlands right now is the highest in our strategic priorities. So I'm currently managing a restoration project up in the Duluth Superior area. Those of you that have been to Jagerfest before probably remember Aloise Bay, which is on the other side of Wisconsin Point. And we're doing bird surveys in there to document which marsh bird target species like rails, bitterns, terns, etc. are using that area. And then that's going to set the stage for some habitat restoration there, because a lot of that has kind of formed a thick, dense cattail mat. And we're going to hope to increase the amount of species, do some things that favor bulrush, wild rice, things like that, open up some of that thick cattail mat back into some channels of water, etc. We're going to be looking for similar projects in the Green Bay area, because that's another huge strategic priority of ours, all the coastal wetlands that go up the west shore and even parts of the east shore of the bay. We also have an Upper Mississippi River initiative going on right now. So hopefully can start some more. They've been doing a lot of, we work with Audubon, Minnesota a lot too, and they've been doing a lot of work with Fish and Wildlife on the Minnesota side of the river. So we're gonna hope to start some things on the Wisconsin side of the river as well. But so yeah, projects like that. Obviously, you heard me use the word partnership a lot tonight, but building partnerships around the state, especially in those areas, but elsewhere too, and partnerships involving IBAs. But then also being in contact with our state Audubon chapters as well. We've obviously got, I think we have 13 Audubon chapters in the state, and part of my role is to have a pulse on what's going on in those chapters and to help them work with each other and other bird clubs as well. So
I was curious what role you'd have with the Audubon chapters in the state.
yeah, so yeah, lots of coordination type stuff, but yeah, I know Audubon Great Lakes is really excited to have a bigger role in Wisconsin now with this position, because their staff mainly was in the Chicago area and Michigan. They've been doing a lot of great restoration work and monitoring in the Chicago area, and then a lot of work with black terns over on the east side of Lake Michigan. So now with my position and a couple other hires they've made, they're really expanding into Wisconsin and a couple other areas.
Well, I can't tell you how grateful we are for your time tonight. I thoroughly enjoyed this presentation, and I've certainly enjoyed working with you on this project through the WBCP.
Yeah.
Tom mentioned this book.
Yeah.
Georgie Steele was the editor for this back in 2007. One of the great early things that then WBCP did. I happen to have 3 extra copies of this book, which goes into great detail about each of the IBAs. And I would entertain emails from anybody who'd like one of them. I somehow ended up with 4. So I would be happy to give away 3 of them. I'll pay the postage. Send me an email if you're interested. And if I get more than 3 responses, I don't know what I'll do. We'll draw lots, I guess. So
Before you sign off, I see there's a new question. It asks about what habitat restoration is being done in the Bay of Green Bay.
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a lot of restoration going on in Green Bay right now. Thankfully, ever since I started grad school here about 8 years ago, there's been a lot of work done. It started with basically just trying to manage all of the Phragmites that we have. But now there's so throughout the Great Lakes, they've identified areas of concern. And that's like a federal effort to clean up areas with a lot of pollution effects and things like that. And Green Bay is one of the main areas of concern federally. So they've identified several projects and begun work on several projects. Like if you go to Ken Muir's, a place that used to, before I was bird watching in the state, there were a lot of shorebirds, a lot of rare birds, but just really high numbers of shorebirds, terns, ducks, in that corner of the bay down by Ken Muir's. And then for the last at least 10 years, it kind of turned into a dump with a lot of buckthorn and cattail phragmites, pretty unsightly place where you didn't really even want to go to at all. And a lot of partners in the area, DNR, but also Ducks Unlimited, Fish and Wildlife obviously funds some of it, but if you go to Ken Muir's today, it'll look a lot different than if you went there in the last 10 years or so. And that's just one area. They've been doing a lot of restoration on Point Au Sable. That's more through the university and some grants that they've gotten. But yeah, there's a ton of work to do because there's a lot of places in the bay that can be restored, but that's definitely the goal of the AOC program. And that's what I'm gonna be working to help too from Audubon's perspective as a partner as well.
Very exciting. Wow.
Yeah, definitely. It's in my own backyard, so that's nice.
Even better.
Obviously, some people might see my reports from Cat Island, and maybe a couple of you have been able to get out there on some of the NRF or WSO field trips that I lead, but Cat Island is obviously a huge priority too, making sure that that remains good habitat for breeding piping plovers and common terns, as well as all the migratory shorebirds that we've documented there every year. Monitoring those groups of species, and making sure that that habitat is managed, because if that wasn't managed, that would literally grow up into a forest of either shrubs or cottonwoods, and there wouldn't be any shorebird or tern habitat. So it takes a lot of active management to keep that the way it is. And thankfully, a lot of people in Green Bay realize that and work hard to make sure that that happens.
You and Jack Swellstead have filed some pretty impressive eBird lists off Cat Island. So
yeah, I consider myself very lucky to. It was just so lucky. I came to Green Bay not knowing what I wanted to do my graduate research on, and that literally happened to be the year that they started building the Cat Island wave barrier. So I was talking with my advisor, Bob Howe, saying it would be awesome to get some baseline data on what shorebirds are using this area. And he agreed. And that was before we even discovered the piping plovers and a lot of stuff. And it's kind of grown from there. So, yeah.
Did piping plovers nest there this year
They did.
successfully?
They've nested successfully every year since 2016. So I think that's 6 years in a row now. They did have some issues this year with predation and also competition within piping plovers. This was the first time this year where there were more females there than males. So we had a male that was incubating 2 different nests. And for a while he seemed to be doing well. He was splitting his time incubating. In piping plovers, both sexes incubate. And this male was doing pretty well going back and forth. But then unfortunately, something must have got him, either peregrine or maybe something while he was asleep at night, because he disappeared. So unfortunately, both of those nests failed. And then when the chicks hatched, we had some problems with a couple of curious herring gulls And yeah, there's mink out there, which are a very formidable predator too.
Yeah.
So there were some fledglings that made it successfully this year, but not as many as the last couple of years.
Is anybody going to write that up? I'd love to publish that in the birder if there's somebody in a position to do that.
Yeah, I can have them forward to you, Carl, but I believe every year UWGB is responsible for a Cat Island piping plover yearly report.
Okay.
So yeah, I can.
Didn't know that. Yeah, if you could have somebody send me one, I'd be very interested in publishing it.
Yeah, for sure. Like I know they send it to Sumner and some of those other people who you know well, but yeah, I can put a bug in their ear that WSO would be very interested in it too.
Good. I'll ping Sumner while I'm at it too.
Sure.
Okay. Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up now. Tom, again, our gratitude. Thank you very much. Round of applause for Tom.
You're welcome. Yeah, and like I said earlier, it's always an honor to present to this group. I see some people in the audience like Carl, Tom, Marilyn, that I have really great memories birding with as even a young kid. So this
We do too.
a soft spot in my heart.
Glad to see I see your dad on the call as well. John, hello. Good to see you. And Tom, I won't be doing the programming anymore, but I'm sure that the organizations that are involved in the new coalition will want to have you back in a year or two to update us on what Audubon, Great Lakes, and the IBA program are up to. So thanks again.
Yeah.
Sounds good to me.
Folks, good night.
Thank you, Carl.
Yeah.
Thanks, Carl.
Hope you'll participate in the CBC, and we'll chat again sometime.
I hope so. I'm very having you.
Thanks much.
All right.
Good night,
Have a
Tom.
good one, everybody. Nice
Hi,
to see
Tom.
you.
Like,
Bravo.
great big group here. Have a good evening. Happy Thanksgiving to all of you too.
Oh, yes.